Most people can handle failure. What they struggle to survive is humiliation, especially when it happens in front of everyone. One Monday morning, Emily Carter walked into the office expecting nothing more than an ordinary management meeting. She had attended dozens just like it. Quarterly updates, performance reviews, new business goals. Nothing suggested that this meeting would be any different. Instead, she walked out with a lower job title, a smaller salary, and the uncomfortable feeling of hundreds of eyes following her back to her desk. The announcement lasted less than 3 minutes. The embarrassment stayed with her for years. No one laughed. No one needed to. The silence was worse. Co-workers avoided eye contact. Some quietly looked down at their notebooks. Others exchanged brief glances across the room. A few whispered once she had left. Some genuinely felt sorry for her. Others assumed they had just witnessed the end of a promising career. After all, very few people recover from a public demotion. Almost nobody comes back stronger. For the rest of that day, Emily answered emails, attended meetings, smiled when people spoke to her. From the outside, she looked calm, professional, composed. Inside, she replayed those 3 minutes over and over again, wondering what she had done wrong, wondering whether 12 years of hard work had just disappeared in front of everyone she respected. That afternoon, she packed her notebook, shut down her computer, and walked through the office one last time before heading home. It was one of the longest walks of her life. What Emily didn't know was that the worst day of her career would quietly become the beginning of something far greater. Because 5 years later, the same employees who watched her lose her position would stand up when she entered the room. Not out of sympathy, out of respect, because she wasn't returning as a manager. She was returning as the executive, now leading the entire division. And that's what makes this story so remarkable. But to understand how one humiliating meeting changed the course of Emily's career, we have to go back to the day she walked into a meeting that changed her life. This is her story. Emily Carter had built a reputation as one of the company's most dependable managers. She wasn't the loudest person in the room. She wasn't the most charismatic. She simply believed that results spoke louder than promises. Year after year, they did. Projects finished on time. Budgets stayed under control. Teams exceeded expectations. Clients renewed their contracts. New employees often requested to work on Emily's team because they knew exactly what to expect. Honesty, preparation, consistency. If there was a difficult project that nobody wanted, it usually ended up on Emily's desk. Not because people wanted to make her job harder, because they trusted she would find a way to make it work. Slowly, her reputation spread throughout the company. Co-workers respected her. Clients trusted her. Senior leadership frequently pointed to her department as an example of how things should be done. Then everything changed. The board hired a new executive to oversee operations. His arrival was announced with great enthusiasm, an impressive resume, a reputation for transforming struggling businesses, a management style that promised to modernize the company. During their first meeting, Emily came prepared with reports, performance data, and suggestions for improving efficiency. The executive barely looked at them. Instead, he talked about culture, visibility, influence, personal branding. Emily had spent her entire career believing that performance created opportunities. He seemed to believe that perception created power. Over the following months, the atmosphere inside the company slowly began to change. Meetings became less about solving problems and more about presenting ideas. Visibility became more valuable than consistency. Politics became more important than performance. Emily tried to ignore it. She kept doing what she had always done. She assumed that eventually the numbers would speak for themselves. But the numbers weren't driving the decisions anymore. Relationships were. The new executive wanted different leaders, different priorities, people who would embrace his vision without questioning it. For the first time in her career, being good at her job no longer guaranteed that her job was safe. She didn't know it yet. But the meeting that would change her career forever was already being planned behind closed doors. The meeting was supposed to be routine. Emily had attended dozens like it over the years. Nothing about that Monday morning felt unusual. Managers filled the conference room. Coffee cups rested beside notebooks. Then the new executive walked in. He thanked everyone for coming, spoke briefly about the company's future. Then he announced a restructuring. Departments would be reorganized. Several managers would be reassigned. Emily listened carefully, assuming she would be hearing about changes affecting other departments. Then she heard her own name. The executive looked directly at her, calmly, professionally. He explained that, effective immediately, Emily would be stepping down into a lower management position. According to him, the decision would better align the organization with its new strategic direction. Nobody argued. Nobody asked questions. The room became painfully quiet. Emily could feel dozens of people looking in her direction. Some quickly looked away. Others stared at the table. She forced herself to nod, managed a polite smile, and thanked the executive for the opportunity to continue contributing to the company, even though inside she felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath her. When the meeting ended, people filed quietly toward the door. One gently touched her shoulder before walking away. Another whispered, "I'm so sorry." Emily simply smiled, picked up the notebook she had carried into the meeting, and walked back across the office. It was one of the longest walks of her life. For the rest of the afternoon, she sat at the same desk, answered emails, attended meetings. From the outside, nothing seemed different. Inside, everything had changed. She wasn't grieving the title or even the salary. She was grieving something much harder to replace, her confidence. When she finally left the building that evening, she sat alone inside her car for several minutes. The engine was off. The parking lot was almost empty. She stared through the windshield, asking herself the same question over and over. Do I stay, or do I start over somewhere else? She didn't realize it then, but that question would become the turning point of her entire career. Take a moment and picture yourself in Emily's position. You've spent years earning people's respect, building your reputation, leading successful teams. Then, in less than 3 minutes, everything changes, not behind closed doors, but in front of the very people you've worked beside for years. What would you do? Because that's exactly where Emily finds herself now. If you're enjoying stories about leadership, resilience, and impossible comebacks, make sure to subscribe. We publish a brand new business story every single day. Now let's see how the worst day of Emily's career became the foundation of her greatest success. The weeks that followed were some of the most difficult of Emily's career. Every morning she walked into the same office, past the same people. The only difference was that she no longer walked in with the authority she had spent years earning. At first, she caught herself replaying the meeting over and over again. Eventually, she stopped, because she finally realized something. She couldn't control what had happened. She could only control who she became because of it. From that day forward, Emily made a quiet decision. If the company was going to give her a smaller title, she wasn't going to let it give her a smaller mindset. She stopped chasing recognition. Instead, she became a student again. She mastered new systems that most managers ignored, learned emerging technologies before anyone else in her department, studied negotiation, communication, conflict resolution, leadership psychology. She enrolled in evening courses, read books during her commute. She also did something that surprised many of her co-workers. Instead of becoming bitter, she became more helpful. She volunteered for cross-department projects, built relationships with people throughout the company, instead of focusing only on her own department. Slowly, something unexpected began to happen. People stopped seeing Emily as the manager who had been demoted. They started seeing her as the person who always knew how to solve difficult problems. She no longer had the highest title, but she had quietly become one of the most respected people in the building. Months turned into years. Emily never complained publicly, never criticized the executive who had demoted her. She let her work speak for her. What she didn't realize was that someone had been paying attention all along, not inside her company, outside it. One afternoon, her phone rang. The caller introduced himself as an executive recruiter. A competing company had been quietly following Emily's work for more than a year. They had spoken with former colleagues, current clients, industry contacts, and they all kept hearing the same name: Emily Carter. The recruiter asked a simple question. "Would you be open to having a conversation?" For the first time since that meeting, she smiled, not because someone had finally recognized her value, because she had spent years becoming the kind of leader recognition could no longer ignore. Emily didn't accept the recruiter's offer immediately. The company was smaller, the role was bigger, the risk was real. For the first time in years, the decision wasn't driven by fear, it was driven by possibility. So she accepted. Her first months weren't easy. The division she inherited had been struggling for years. Deadlines were constantly missed. Employee morale was low. Several senior managers believed the problems couldn't be fixed. Emily disagreed. Instead of making dramatic changes on her first day, she listened. She met with employees at every level, visited clients, observed processes. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. The problems weren't caused by a lack of talent. They were caused by a lack of trust. Teams weren't working together. Employees had stopped believing their ideas mattered. Emily had seen that before. She knew exactly where it led, so she focused on rebuilding something many companies overlooked. Culture. One conversation at a time. Changes weren't dramatic. They were consistent. Communication became clearer. Accountability became fairer. People began believing in the company again, and once they believed, the results followed. Within a few years, revenue increased, customer retention reached record levels, employee satisfaction improved dramatically. The struggling division had become one of the strongest performers in the industry. Publications began highlighting the turnaround. Leadership conferences invited Emily to share her approach. Then, one afternoon, her assistant knocked gently on the office door. "There's someone on the phone asking for you." The Demoted voice on the other end introduced himself as a member of the board from her former company, Sus. Great deal had changed since she left. The company had new ownership. The executive, who had publicly demoted her years earlier, was gone. The board was searching for someone to lead the entire division, someone who understood the business, someone respected by employees. After months of interviewing candidates, one name kept appearing: Emily Carter. She wasn't simply one of the candidates, she was their first choice. 5 years earlier, she had walked out of that same company, believing her career had ended inside those walls. Now, the very people responsible for shaping its future were asking her to come back, not to reclaim the title she had lost, but to accept one far greater than she had ever imagined. This time, she wasn't walking into the building hoping to keep her job. She was walking in to lead it. 5 years after the public demotion, Emily Carter walked through the same office doors she had once left, questioning her entire career. The same reception desk greeted her, the same elevators carried her upstairs. So much looked exactly as she remembered, and yet everything felt different. Many of the same employees were still there. Some had been in that room the day she was publicly demoted. They never imagined they would see her return. At least, not like this. This time, people stood up as she entered the room, not because anyone had instructed them, but because respect had a way of revealing itself without being requested. Emily was no longer a department manager. She was now leading the entire division. Her first week surprised many employees. Some expected dramatic changes. A few even wondered whether she would use her new authority to settle old scores. Emily did none of those things. She never spoke about revenge. She never criticized the executive who had demoted her. As far as she was concerned, the past had already done its job. It had taught her everything she needed to know. Instead, she focused on building the kind of workplace she had once wished existed, one where people could disagree without fear, where performance mattered more than politics, where difficult conversations happened behind closed doors, never as public. Humiliation. She understood what it felt like to lose confidence, to question your value, because she had lived it. That made her a different kind of leader, one who listened before speaking, who corrected without humiliating. Months later, during a leadership event, someone asked the question many people had been wondering. "Do you feel vindicated?" Emily smiled, then answered quietly, "I didn't come back to prove anyone wrong. I came back because I had become the leader I needed to become." The room fell silent. Years earlier, people had watched Emily walk back to her desk, believing her career was over. Years later, they watched her walk into that same building as the leader of the entire division. The office hadn't changed. The people hadn't changed. The biggest difference was that the woman who once measured success by her position had learned to measure it by the person she had become 5 years earlier. She walked back to her desk feeling hundreds of eyes on her. 5 years later, many of those same people stood as she walked into the room, not because her title had changed, because she had Emily's. Story reminds us that your career isn't defined by one meeting, or one title, or one person's opinion. The people around you may decide your position. They may even underestimate your potential. But they can never decide who you choose to become after. Everything falls apart. Emily couldn't control what happened in that conference room, but she could decide what happened next. She let that meeting become the beginning of a better story instead of the end of her old one. 5 years later, she didn't walk back into that building carrying resentment. She walked back, carrying perspective, experience, and the kind of leadership that can only be earned by overcoming adversity. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, and have you ever been underestimated at work? Looking back, did it push you towards something even better? I read every single one. Years earlier, Emily walked into a meeting believing she was about to discuss the future of the company. She walked out believing her own future had just ended. Looking back, she realized it had only just begun, and maybe that's the most important lesson of all. Come back. Tomorrow, the next story might change the way you think. See you tomorrow.